Get started this morning. I'm with the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. And that the Northwest Fire Science Consortium is part of a national network that's funded by the Joint Fire Science Program to accelerate the awareness, understanding, and use of fire and fuel science. So in essence, we bring people together and share knowledge. This webinar series has also been co-organized by the Oregon State University Extension Fire Program, and we have Emily Jane Davis here from that program as well. Emily, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. My name is EJ Davis. I'm the interim director of the Extension Fire Program at OSU, and we support wildfire outreach and education and partnerships to help prepare communities and landscapes for a fire. And we were interested in co-sponsoring this series with the Fire Science Consortium because we know and recognize that fire can have disproportionate effects on vulnerable communities, and access to resources to prepare and mitigate those impacts can also be disproportionate. And having good and current data and tools to understand socially vulnerable communities and where they are and what those vulnerabilities are is part of the way to work on that. So we're really looking forward to this discussion and really appreciate the presentation that's going to happen today.
Great, thanks, EJ. And one other thing I wanted to note is that we do have live transcription is enabled. And so by default, you may have captions at the bottom of your screen. If you find those distracting and don't want to see them, you can go to the CC live transcription button at the bottom menu of your Zoom screen and hide them. You can also click on the full transcription and see it as it's transcribed in a separate window, if that's easier for you or you'd prefer. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters today. We have Mindy Crandall. She is an associate professor of forest policy in the Department of Forest Engineering, Resources and Management at Oregon State University. Her research focuses on forest and human community interactions. And we also have Caitlin Riley. She is a graduate student at Oregon State University and the College of Forestry. Her MS research focuses on the intersections of wildfire and human communities, including mapping socially vulnerable communities for the state of Oregon to inform more equitable wildfire policy implementation. We also have Mirka McCune with us today. Mirka is a GIS analyst and project manager with the Institute for Natural Resources at Oregon State University. She led the work to develop the Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer tool that houses the Social Vulnerability Index map layers for Oregon. And she will be available to answer questions on that tool in the session as those come up. So without further ado, Mindy and Caitlin, take it away.
Thanks, Autumn, for all those fabulous introductions. I'm just going to go ahead and share our presentation. All right, Autumn, can you see that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, well, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Caitlin, as Autumn said, and I'm going to get us started today talking about the application of a social vulnerability index to kind of the unique context of Oregon's recent state wildfire policy, Senate Bill 762. So we've structured this presentation today as sort of starting with an overview of community wildfire risk, and then a discussion of what social vulnerability is and how we measure it, as well as some other commonly referenced social indices, before diving into a more deep discussion of Senate Bill 762 and the social vulnerability and wildfire risk mapping that was conducted as part of that bill. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty details of methods and data, as well as where to access maps and data, and also talk about strengths and limitations before taking questions and having a discussion about social vulnerability mapping tools in general. So to get us started, I just wanted to highlight some ways that human communities interact with wildfire. To start, humans cause ignitions. They are responsible for the majority of ignitions in the United States. And in the past 3 decades in the state of Oregon, humans have accounted for the majority of ignitions as well. So we significantly influence wildfire occurrence in that way. Humans also have altered the landscape and contributed to climate change, which has changed wildfire patterns and behavior and has led to more frequent, severe wildfires over longer wildfire seasons. So not only are we, changing the patterns of when and where wildfire occurs, we are also increasingly susceptible to the impacts of wildfire. Human communities are expanding into forested landscapes. This is known as the wildland-urban interface, places where human developments intermix or intermingle with vegetation, and that is putting more human lives and homes at risk. So community vulnerability to wildfire is a function of both this idea of physical vulnerability, which is composed of those climate and vegetation factors that influence what is the actual probability that a wildfire will happen, but also how intense is that wildfire. Those combined make up physical vulnerability, which is referred to as wildfire hazard potential. But there's a whole other side of this community vulnerability framework, and that is the idea of social vulnerability. And this really speaks to this idea that there are social, economic, and cultural attributes that can also confer or limit access to resources. As EJ was mentioning, we know that not all communities are equally equipped to prevent, respond to, and recover from hazards. And we've seen that to be true in the context of wildfire as well. So in this framework, some of those social, economic, and cultural factors that may be proxies for access to resources include things like socioeconomic status, language and education, housing and transportation, and demographic information. So social vulnerability indices are commonly used to measure this idea that there's differential vulnerability or resilience to hazards. And the way that they do that is through combining social, economic, and environmental data. And these data are really just proxies for factors that either literature has led us to believe may contribute to vulnerability, or based on expert knowledge and other information related to the capacity of communities to either prepare for, respond to, or recover from a hazardous event such as wildfire. And the strength of these is that they allow us to have one kind of composite score that can be mapped and can provide information that can assist decision makers in prioritizing resources and planning for hazardous events either before or after. So the photo here is a picture of one really commonly referenced social vulnerability index, which was developed by Susan Cutter, who really pioneered this work in the early 2000s. And this is hosted by the Hazards and Vulnerability Research Institute at the University of South Carolina. And it shows social vulnerability by US county. However, there are many social indices, and this is a field that has really expanded in the past couple of decades, especially in the context of disaster management. We're seeing sort of this increase in available assessment tools and indices that can be used to understand concepts of vulnerability or resilience to hazard, and that can create some confusion. So we have a number of tools that are commonly referenced as being used for this purpose. I'm going to just kind of talk through similarities and differences between them to set the stage for why we chose to do, why we chose to use the tool we used for Senate Bill 762. So social vulnerability is a construct that really developed out of the hazards and disaster literature. And as a result of that, the social vulnerability indices are really tailored to address environmental hazards. They typically focus on these social and economic factors that influence vulnerability and are commonly used in disaster and risk management. Adaptive capacity and community resilience have also become more widely utilized in the context of disaster management, but their roots are actually in the field of ecology, especially resilience, which was originally sort of conceptualized as the way that ecosystems respond to disturbance, but has more recently been applied in the field of disaster management. So these indices are very similar to social vulnerability indices, though often they include sort of a broader scope of variables. So they will sometimes include environmental or ecological factors that you don't typically see in a social vulnerability index. And then finally, we have environmental justice indices and mapping tools, which really spawned from the environmental justice movement and have a very specific purpose, and that is to understand where human-caused environmental hazards such as pollution or climate change intersect with social vulnerability. And that can be a useful tool for understanding vulnerability or resilience to hazards, but isn't maybe necessarily what environmental screening or environmental justice tools were designed for. So we thought we'd start with that sort of overview because we get a lot of questions about how does one tool relate to another tool, or what is the difference between this index and that index? And it really boils down to that there are a lot of similarities, especially in terms of the data that are used to inform them. But there are also some key differences, and those key differences are sort of the intended purpose, which really, as I mentioned, comes from where that tool, like what academic discipline and framework that tool was developed within. And then that then informs which indicators are incorporated into the tool. And then there are some sort of finer details that differ between all of these indices, including things like what level of geography they end up being mapped at and what methodologies are used to create that composite overall score. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit now and start really highlighting how we applied this tool in the context of state wildfire policy in Oregon. So Senate Bill 762 is Oregon's first comprehensive piece of wildfire legislation. It passed in 2021 and allocates $220 million to help Oregon modernize and improve wildfire preparedness and response. It does that in a number of ways. This is a big omnibus bill. This figure on the slide maps some of the key measures in the bill to the 3 goals of the National Cohesive Wildfire Strategy, which include building more resilient landscapes, building fire adapted communities, and increasing response capacity. So a few measures in the bill that address these 3 goals include greater funding for fuel reduction programs that might help make Oregon's landscapes more resilient, as well as updating defensible space and building codes for increasing fire adapted communities. And then there are mechanisms within the bill to try and improve response capacity as well. One thing to note is that this is a very large bill and it's being implemented across a wide number of agencies and organizations. So Senate Bill 762 aims to address equity in a number of ways. We see language in the bill reflecting the desire to advance equity in state policy in Section 8A, where the Oregon State Fire Marshal's Office is directed to allocate grants for members of socially and economically vulnerable communities. These are grants for defensible space. And then Section 22, which pertains to the Wildfire Workforce Program, also sort of directs the agency responsible for implementing that to consider equity both in who they recruit as part of that program and then the projects that they carry out as well. So there are lots of things in this bill that pertain to physical vulnerability. And as a result of that, the need for decision support tools is very apparent. And so the legislators wrote into this bill Section 7, which is a very key aspect of Senate Bill 762, in that it calls for the creation of 3 maps to be created by Oregon State University and made publicly available through the Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer tool. Those first 2 maps are a wildfire risk map, which is shown here on the left and shows wildfire risk from no risk all the way to extreme risk. And then the second map is a map of the wildland-urban interface, which, as I mentioned earlier, is those areas where human developments intermix or intermingle with wildland vegetation and therefore may be higher risk. So those 2 maps are directly informing many aspects of Senate Bill 762. But in addition to that, the Section 7 also called for the inclusion of a layer that geospatially displays the locations of socially and economically vulnerable communities. So in order to create a layer that met the needs of Senate Bill 762, researchers at Oregon State University really did a pretty comprehensive review of the existing indices that could be adapted for such purposes. And we engaged with end users of the tool, stakeholders, other academics and agency practitioners who were interested in social vulnerability throughout the process to try and understand which of these frameworks and tools might be best suited for meeting the needs of Senate Bill 762. This slide just has a few examples of tools that we looked at throughout the process to try and understand what might be best as far as data and methodologies. And I'll just highlight a few, but this is a great slide for reference later if you're interested in sort of the similarities and differences between tools. So on the far left, we have 2 social vulnerability indices. One I mentioned earlier, which was developed by Susan Cutter and the Hazards and Vulnerability Research Institute. And that combines those 30 socioeconomic variables into a social vulnerability index that's mapped at the county level. This is designed for environmental hazards. and is really designed to inform disaster preparedness. Very similar to that is the Center for Disease Control Social Vulnerability Index. That uses kind of a subset of those variables, 15 socioeconomic variables, and maps social vulnerability at the tract level, which we'll talk more about these levels of geography later if you're not familiar with census geographies, but it's a finer level of geography. And the CDC SBI, very similarly, is designed to help emergency response planners and public health officials identify and map communities that may need more support around hazardous events. So these can sort of be compared to other indices like the Baseline Resilience Indicators for Communities Index, which is a resilience index designed for disaster preparedness and includes around 50 variables that measure overall pre-existing community resilience and are mapped at the county level as well. And then we have at the far right some of these environmental justice and climate screening tools, which you can see, and as I mentioned earlier, the purpose of these tools is slightly different. These combine environmental and demographic variables to screen for areas where there's an intersection of environmental injustice and social vulnerability, and really to advance more equitable laws and policies in the environmental sphere. So after considering all of those things, we came to this place of feeling as though social vulnerability was the best construct to use to meet the needs of Senate Bill 762, but we also had some really important criteria and considerations that needed to be made as well. And one of those things that was most important to us was that this tool really needed to be useful to practitioners on the ground. And so understanding what data and methods to use and how to communicate all of those data and methods out to a very wide array of agency personnel and community members was a really important part of this process, and something that Mindy will talk more about and we can discuss later as well. But some of those key considerations also included trade-offs between level of geography and data reliability, as well as how to make the map accessible, symbology within the map, and communication of that data. So I'm going to turn it over to my advisor, Dr. Mindy Crandall, to walk us through more details on all of those.
Thanks, Caitlin. So hopefully that sets the stage pretty well for what we were doing and why. It's a pretty unique context to this Senate Bill 762 in the way that it really, I think it's really interesting because it sets a policy goal at the state level, legislatively mandated, involves academics. They were really interested in using best science and best practices to do this. And then we're passing this information back to state agencies. And it's being used in a variety of ways, as Caitlin alluded to. So some of this is to advance equity considerations, but some of the risk and the WUI maps, right, are really about where do we maybe need to think more strictly about how we build houses and where people live. So that's kind of the background, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the data and the methods. So as Caitlin said, we had a number of considerations, and we decided to adopt the CDC SBI methodology for this purpose. As we mentioned, it's really built around the original SOBI, and it is just a subset of that data, and the focus of it and the intent of the CDC SBI seemed to match really well what we wanted to accomplish here under Senate Bill 762. It was developed specifically for hazards and risk management. It relies on census data, and there's pros and cons to that. But one of the big pros of that is that all of this data gets updated and released simultaneously. So whenever a new release of data comes out, you can recalculate it and update it. And as part of Senate Bill 762, there is written in this need to update this information periodically. And so we wanted to also create a layer that was replicable using a standard methodology. The way the CDC works is that, as Caitlin mentioned, it has 15 indicators, and these are grouped into 4 themes. And if you think back to that wildfire overall vulnerability framework, those were also grouped into various themes, those aspects of human communities. And so the 4 themes that make up the overall SBI are socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, and housing and transportation. And you can see the component indicators for each of those themes on the right-hand side of your screen. They have to do with poverty, income, education, basic demographics, language capability, and then some factors that we think might make people more physically vulnerable based on their housing conditions. So as Caitlin alluded to, if you are not super familiar with census geography, most people are very, very familiar with their county, right? That's a very relevant level of geography that we interact with all the time in our communities. And most of us are part of a community, a town or a place. But the census actually has a lot of different levels of geography available. Census data at its core is gathered at the block level, and those are aggregated up to block groups, which is the base level of data at which that's most easily publicly available. So block groups are groups of about 600 to 3,000 in population. They're an aggregate designation. And because they're defined around a population size, that means that they're very small in urban areas and very large in rural areas. So their actual geographic area varies widely. The number of people inside each does not vary as much. The same is true of tracts. So some people might be familiar with census tract also as a level of geography. That's just an aggregation of block groups. Again, it's really designed to be around 4,000 to 5,000 people. So smaller in urban areas, larger in rural areas. A lesser known type of census geography is actually the county subdivisions, which work pretty well in the eastern part of the country. They're often related to townships or municipalities, but out here in the West, where we don't have a lot of incorporated land, they work pretty well as communities. So they are designated by the census in cooperation with local input committees, and they're designed to represent an area of concentrated population that has suitable and distinguishable features for a boundary. So they don't have any population criteria. They tend to be more similar in area and far more variable in population. So if you're familiar with Oregon, Eugene, the second largest city, right, would be one community under the county subdivision, but would have many, many tracts and block groups within it. And a town like Oak Ridge, which is a very rural town in eastern Lane County, might be one block group or one tract and one county subdivision. So we took this information to a lot of our community partners and stakeholders and agency folks, and we had some conversations, because the big trade-off here, from our understanding, was going to be in data reliability. Our community partners, and we knew that counties wasn't going to work very well for this purpose, because there's only 36 counties in all of Oregon, and we needed more than 36 data points to really understand fine scale vulnerability that could be used in the way that Senate Bill 762 wanted it to be used. What we overwhelmingly heard from our community partners is they wanted specificity. So in order to look more closely about that trade-off, however, we needed to dive into the reliability of these indicators. We're relying on what's called the ACS for these, the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey replaced the census long form after 2000. So we're all probably pretty familiar with the decennial census, which is the 100% count of a few key variables, but all of the more interesting data around income and poverty and education and things used to come from the census long form, which was also done once every 10 years at a subsample of the population. So what the Census Bureau wanted to do is make that data available more frequently than every 10 years. And so they moved to the ACS model, which samples households in a rolling panel. And it works really well for urban areas because that sample can be big enough for an annual release of data. It doesn't work as well for rural areas, which is a large part of our state. We have a very dispersed population. And so for rural areas, it requires 5 years of survey data to be combined for each release. So when we talk about ACS 2020 data, it's really important to keep in mind that that's actually an aggregate of information collected between 2016 and 2020. It's also important to note that even if we had chosen a county level of data for this process, in Oregon, we have so many counties that have fewer than just a few thousand people. We still would be using the 5-year ACS information. Don't meet that minimum population criteria for an annual release of that data. So we took a look at reliability using coefficient of variance, and it's just a standard measure of reliability of a survey estimate. There's really no hard and fast rules around what constitutes a good estimate. But what we can say is the lower the CV, the more reliable the data is. And so what we did is we took, for each of our levels of geography under consideration, we took each of the component indicators and where we could calculated the CV based on the Census Bureau's release of the margin of error for each of those indicators. And we flagged Estimates with CVs less than or equal to 12 as high reliability. This comes from some work done by ESRI related to using ACS data in mapping. We flagged those with CVs between 12 and 40 as medium reliability, and ones that have very large CVs over 40 as low reliability. And we looked at the proportion of those component indicators in those different bins by each level of geography, to look more carefully at the trade-offs between using the most specific layer, which is block groups, to the least specific layer, which is probably county subdivisions. And you can see that although because we have these differences in the way these geographies are defined, right? The population is more consistent across tracts and block groups. So those tend to go pretty similar in terms of their reliability. What you can see is that actually at the county subdivision level, we had more of our component indicators in high reliability, but there wasn't a lot of difference between tracts and block groups in those high reliability, in that high reliability category. Which is kind of a long way of saying that in that trade-off we were considering between reliability and specificity, we opted for specificity as requested by our agency partners, because to us, it didn't look like we were losing that much in the trade-off. So how do we calculate SVI? As you saw, there are all those component indicators. One thing I will say is that at the block group level, not all 15 of those were available. There's actually 13 that were available. But what we do is basically take all the block groups for Oregon, gather all the data of those indicators. And then for each theme, we start with those 4 different themes. We take each indicator and we just percentile rank them. So basically, if you take a look at this very artificial example, we have the indicator 1 of poverty. Block group 3 has the highest level of poverty. Block group 4 has the lowest. And so we just percentile rank them. We index the highest to 1, the lowest to 0, and the score that everybody gets in between represents what proportion of block groups fall below them on that indicator. We do this for all the indicators to flag high values as socially vulnerable. So you can see that in the percentile ranking there, right, median income is reversed, where it's actually the lowest value that represents the highest vulnerability. We sum all those up for the indicators in that theme, and then we percentile rank that total to get us a percentile rank for that theme. And then we repeat the process to calculate the final SVI. And one of the things that makes this very useful is that it kind of has an intuitive interpretation, right? So if you look at the far right column, block group number 3 has the highest overall SVI value of this sample. So they get 100%, which means they're most likely to be vulnerable, and 100% of the other values fall below them in that social vulnerability ranking. So what does this look like on the map? You already saw a little preview of it, but this is on the left. That is the map of relative SVI as we have it from using the 2020 ACS data for all of the state of Oregon at the block group level. And we can zoom in a little bit closer. This is Lane County on the right-hand side. Again, Eugene is there. You can see that urban center has a lot of block groups in it that are very small. And you can see the rural parts of the county on the west and on the east have these very large block groups where there's a far more dispersed population. When you go to the tool, and what we have available on the map interface is not only the overall social vulnerability, but each of the 4 component themes mapped separately. Because there may be cases where from an equity or an allocation of resources perspective, you might be interested in one of these components more than another. Maybe it's about housing type and transportation. Maybe it's about socioeconomic status, or maybe it's overall vulnerability. So that we provided those options for people to look at themselves and to utilize themselves. One thing to note is that, for example, we don't create a threshold of what constitutes social vulnerability here. We divide all the block groups into 1 of 4 categories just using quartiles. So they go from low to high. And this is because we don't really feel like there is enough objective threshold that can tell us for certain which of these communities are socially vulnerable. This is a relative measure. It ranks Oregon against Oregon, Oregon block groups against Oregon. What it does tell us is places where there's a higher likelihood that those places are going to be vulnerable to disasters than compared to the rest of the state. And so we have them ranked just from lowest, low to moderate, moderate to high, and highest vulnerability. We have them binned in the symbology by that. But as we'll show you, when you click on any of these, you can get the actual score, so you can understand what the actual score is. The CDC, they do flag the highest 10% as being socially vulnerable, but because this map may be used by different practitioners for different purposes, we wanted to just give them the information and let them decide what their threshold level might be. I also want to kind of highlight a couple of things, and we'll circle back around to this because I think these are really important points about these indices. Social vulnerability is a really complex topic, right, that covers many elements of people's lives and livelihoods. And we're using a metric based on available data, publicly available data that's available across the whole nation so that you can compare it to other places. And it's an estimate of community characteristics. And we know that these vary over space and time. So, for example, in an area mapped as low vulnerability, we may be masking some households that are super vulnerable to impacts of wildfire because we're using these aggregate measures. Conversely, we also may be just capturing things that have big impact on social vulnerability that can't be captured in a number that's gathered by the Census Bureau. So we might be missing lots of pieces of really important information. And so we really recommend that these tools be used in conjunction with other information whenever possible, especially if you're making decisions about how to allocate resources or granting funds to individuals or households within these communities. So here's a look, and we'll go to the Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer at the end of this, once we're out of the slide zone. And I just want to again emphasize Mirka McCune and her role in putting all this together. So Oregon has developed decades ago, actually, this really great web tool that houses and puts forth publicly a ton of data around Oregon. And it's the Oregon Explorer, and there's many, many layers within it. Now, one piece of the Oregon Explorer now is the Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer. And you can see in that legend on the left-hand side, right, there's a lot of stuff about those physical risks to vulnerabilities to wildfire in it. And it also houses our social vulnerability map layer so that that can be used in conjunction with the other pieces of information that were developed specifically for Senate Bill 762. It pops up when you click on social vulnerability. It tells you that final composite score at the block group level. But again, also contained within this interface, if you click on any block group, you can find lots of pieces of information. So as I mentioned, you can see on the pop-up menu that shows on the left side of the screen capture, you get the overall SVI score and an interpretation of that. Is it high, medium to high, moderate to low, or low? And it tells you this block group should say, has higher social vulnerability than 78% of the rest of Oregon. It also breaks down the theme scores, even when you go, as I mentioned, you can map those in component theme scores as well, and tells you the component indicators for each theme and the raw data that was used as the input into the SVI. So all of that information, and again, those percentile scores for the themes are interpreted the same way as the total SVI in this tool. So all of this is publicly available and accessible to anyone in the state or beyond that would like to use this information. In addition, because through extensive conversations with our agency stakeholder ad hoc working group related to this topic, we settled on mapping just the block groups so that anyone who was going to the Wildfire Risk Explorer, any two people who were going to that would receive the same piece of information when they looked at that tool. And we thought that was really important for consistency, especially compared to the other layers that are going into this. The WUI doesn't change based on who's looking at it, and the wildfire risk doesn't change. So it seemed important to just present one level of geography that could be the most easily accessible, tailored to the needs of the agencies. However, having said that, we also recognize that more advanced users might want the option of looking at different levels of geography. So to do that, we actually created the SVI for the block group, the tract, and the county subdivision, and all those data sets are posted publicly available through Oregon State University's Scholars Archive. And this is what it looks like if you go to Scholars Archive and you search for this data set, which is just called Social Vulnerability Index for the state of Oregon. What you get when you go there is the CSV files that give you those social vulnerability data for the different levels of geography. Also the R files containing the code that Caitlin built to harvest all of this data from the US Census and to calculate the SVI, as well as technical documentation describing in more detail the methods and exactly what all those component indicators are. So that is also available to anyone who is interested. Before we go and look at the Wildfire Risk Explorer tool itself, I just want to take a minute to kind of circle back around to those strengths and limitations. So what does SVI do in this context? It does give us a look at socioeconomic inequalities, that we believe will influence wildfire prevention, response, and recovery at the most detailed level of geography publicly and easily available. We believe that this confers the most usefulness, replicability, and easiest to understand of the tools. It provides people the ability to dig into the individual components, not just the raw variables, but also the themes, because those may also be of interest. It's built around an SVI that was designed for emergency response and disaster management and is widely utilized. Both the SOVI and the CDC SVI, those are kind of some of the foundational SVIs that were developed. And so they are probably the most familiar of any. Again, it can be mapped at multiple geographies and updated as often as annually with newly released ACS data, right? So whenever ACS data is released, which is annually, the timing of that varies based on the census's ability to clear it, to clean it up and get it to a level that is okay for public release. But it can be updated fairly seamlessly. Some big limitations though. We use block groups. They don't represent communities, right? They may or they may not. And certainly in urban areas, they don't. They probably represent sub-neighborhoods, if anything. And they don't really map to people's identification of their community. However, they are the finest level of detail. As I've already mentioned, they can't tell us a lot about specific individuals or households. These are aggregate measures, and we could be masking high vulnerability households in low vulnerability areas. Conversely, we could be identifying high vulnerability areas that don't contain 100% high vulnerability households. They're indicators, right? They're proxies for factors we believe to be related to vulnerability, and it doesn't encompass everything that matters. We know that. And just like our wildfire risk, because our vegetation keeps growing and changing over time, these are static snapshots of a dynamic landscape. And we do also have a data lag, right? So not only are we dealing with rural areas, so we have to use a 5-year compilation of ACS data, but the best we could do with the data that was released in March, right, is 2020. It's a snapshot of a dynamic landscape. Humans move, they migrate, the community characteristics change. And so that's a limitation of everything we do when we're dealing with systems that are constantly in change. Right? Okay, before we go to the Wildfire Risk Explorer tool, which is going to take me just a minute to pull up, I just wanted to throw out a couple of things up here. There is a general email for all inquiries related to the OSU wildfire risk maps. And if you inquire to this email, OSU wildfire risk at oregonstate.edu, and it's related to SVI, they'll pass you on to us. Or you can also just contact either of us anytime. We're happy to chat about this. My contact information is there, as well as Caitlin's. And this webinar, as Autumn mentioned, will be recorded and posted online, so you can revisit it at any time. In addition, there will be a web page. It's not quite up yet. We were under a time crunch to get all this out by June 30th, which was the deadline as indicated in the legislature. So, but there is a website that's coming that will have a lot of FAQs, and it has a sort of both a technical documentation, but also a more sort of user-friendly description of SVI on that website. Coming soon. Okay. We're going to come back to this question for the discussion about how people use these maps and data. But first, I want to go to our Risk Explorer. So bear with me for 1 minute while we get this loaded. And then we will go to our Q&A. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer screen. This is what it looks like when you go to that web page, what you land on. There's a description here, and again, thanks to the genius of INR and Mirica in particular, right? You can just type in any address for Oregon and it'll highlight it on the map, and it will show you your mapped wildfire vulnerability, whether or not you're in the WUI, and the social vulnerability. So all of that capacity is there. Here is that email if you have further questions. And then you can dive into all this a little bit more by clicking Go to Layers. And when you do that, you see that the one that's highlighted currently by default is the risk classification. But there's a whole bunch of other layers here, right, that you can toggle on or off to explore aspects related to wildfire vulnerability or social vulnerability. So if we take off risk and we turn on social vulnerability, we can map the level, the total overall SVI for this state at the block group level. That's what first pops up. And then again, notice you can map just the themes: socioeconomic status, household composition, right? You can toggle between those. Another thing that I want to just sort of highlight here is that if you go to the information tab, you can see lots of different options here around the metadata. You can actually download the layer, which downloads that CSV file and the census geography. So the CSV file is just a text file, right? But it has a unique geo ID that maps to the census geographic shape files so that you can link these two in any GIS program that you might be using. Whoops, I always get that wrong. To close this. Okay, and so if we go back here, again, you can click on any block group and it pulls up description of what you're looking at, what the block group is, the overall SVI, a little bit of interpretation, the theme scores, and then the breakdown of all the component indicators. There's also links to technical information here that you can find out more in that way. Okay, so I think that's what we had to share today. I will stop sharing my screen and I will let Autumn maybe walk us through if there's any questions that folks have at this time.
Thanks so much, Caitlin and Mindy. Great presentation. So yes, we have a couple questions that were asked in the chat in the Q&A. For one, EJ, would you be willing to put the URL for that Explorer into the chat as well while I go through some of these? A couple folks
Yes, I will go do that. It will just take 1 second.
Oh, thanks so much. Okay, so some questions we have. Carl asks, it seems like the source of data used by many of the indices are similar, i.e. census data, but are applied differently based on weights or methods. Is that a correct statement?
Absolutely, yes. So one big difference that you'll notice if you dive into these is that a lot of these indices that are mapped at the county level do incorporate more different types of non-census data, because the most common level of geography for alternative sources of data to be calculated at is at the county level. So that's, I think, why a lot of these veer towards the county level, because you can include a wider variety of data. But no, for most of these, the only repository of nationwide consistent socioeconomic data is the census. And so that's why most of them default to that. And as you pointed out, differences in the way they're calculated, in weights that are used, and what level of geography they are mapped at.
Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, so here's another question. Is it also thought that this map could inform prescribed fire activity across Oregon? In addition to that, is there any thought about using the methodology to take the mapping one step further and develop the index for potential wildland fire smoke, for both wildfire and prescribed fire smoke and that? Risk to the wildfire itself is important to characterize, but smoke can impact a larger percent of the population, and there are equity considerations there too with respect to access. So that's a question from Jason on prescribed fire activity and smoke.
Yeah, so there's kind of two things going on there. And I will defer to EJ to correct me, because she, being the program lead for our fire extension program, can speak better on the topic of prescribed fire than I can. But I will say, yeah, there's huge potential for this to be used in terms of placing prescribed fire treatments. And I think that's even alluded to in the SB 762 when they talk about the youth corps, right? So not only who's recruited for these programs, but also where they're done. So there's great potential to, if you were a land manager looking at a county and you had a finite budget for your prescribed burning treatments, you could think, well, do I want to do these in communities that are places that are likely to be more impacted should a wildfire occur? Absolutely. That could be part of your decision-making framework, right? So I think there's definitely potential for that, and I hope that it does get used that way ultimately. And now coming back around to the second part of the question, which I already lost because I went down one train. Smoke, thank you. I knew Caitlin would keep track of it. So smoke. There is an aspect of Senate Bill 762 that does address smoke, and it directs the Oregon Health Authority in particular to think about ways to mitigate the impacts of smoke. I think to use something like this in conjunction with that would require a lot of modeling because smoke impacts, well, some of them are kind of predictable based on geography, like basins tend to collect smoke, especially in Southwest Oregon, where we have a more mixed fire regime system, and so they have more fire. But thinking about how smoke travels and impacts is pretty event specific. But it can be used to do things like flag areas where maybe we want to do more investment in giving, say, grants for air filters or something like that. So you can use it in conjunction with sort of mitigating the possible impacts of smoke, even though smoke itself, we can't always predict how those things are going to happen. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Meredith, and she wants to know, how do you think this tool might interface with community-driven processes to define and address vulnerability from the ground up? For example, CWPPs, collaboration, or grassroots environmental justice organizing?
That's such a great question. And we actually were just talking with the fire specialist yesterday, and this topic came up. And the sense that I got is that I really hope it's used, right, to talk about equity in the way that things play out. I think the degree to which it's going to be used is going to be really community specific. So I think there's huge opportunity, especially in developing the CWPPs, to take a look at this finer scale detail that's available to them when they think about how to put this together. Whether or not people do that, I don't know. I mean, I think that's part of the reason why it's really important that we are reaching out to folks like extension agents who may be requested to help participate in CWPPs and provide information so that they know that this tool is available. And I think, so to the degree that the more people know about it as a resource, I think it could be really beneficial, but I think it's going to be really site specific.
Okay. Great. A question from Francisco. What are some of the considerations when developing and applying this approach to areas outside Oregon with very different environmental and socioeconomic characteristics, like Southern California or the Southwest, if you have any sense of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we chose this particular index and methodology is that I think it's pretty relevant across the country. So it gathers some pretty common things that we really I think have a good basis for believing impact vulnerability. Now, there might be other factors at play, and you could adjust them for a region by including different variables that you think might be more relevant. But the fundamental methodology and core tool, I think, can be applied widely. The other advantage of something like this is that if we use the same tool and methodology across the country, we can start to get a sense of how the inter-country variability and social vulnerability is. When we're all using different tools and measures, they're kind of apples and oranges in some ways, although they have a lot of similarities, so there's not a huge amount of variability. But I mean, if take Oregon, for example, it's not a super diverse state, right? And a lot of these are built around demographics and language characteristics that we think really matter. And so there might be particular block groups in Oregon that are high on those metrics of social vulnerability, but overall for the state, those component indicators don't have a lot of variation for us, whereas they would have much more variation in, say, California or the Southwest.
Okay, thank you. A question from Eliza. It seems like the main goal of this SVI is to make it useful to practitioners on the ground. How is it being received in communities? Was there any on-the-ground discussion with the communities, and are there plans to conduct progress reports on how it is being implemented or received? Really interested in knowing more about how adaptive capacity was measured in the study.
Thanks.
I can repeat any part of that if you need. Or
this is great. Like, people have really in-depth questions, but but it's a challenge for my brain on the fly. So anyway, yes, when thinking about communities, since this was just publicized right on June 30th, 2022, we don't have a lot of data yet on how it's being used. I can say that the interest has been really high, and it's a pleasant surprise to me. But we had requests right away from a couple of extension agents, and also from some other folks who are really interested in diving more into vulnerability, including a research project that's being done between a fire chief and some researchers here at Oregon State who want to dive into a little bit more of the nuance of vulnerability. At the community level, we're sort of OSU, we meaning OSU, is just sort of beginning to roll out a widespread outreach effort. We're going to be doing a series of like kind of town hall style meetings or Zoom meetings around the country. I'm sorry, around the state, focused on getting this information out there. Those are going to talk about all three of the map layers, and so it's a lot to cover in a short time frame. By the time you talk about probability of risk to structures, which is the risk map, the WUI map, and the social vulnerability map, we really just provide a high level overview of these component factors. I would say I'm hopeful that people who, that the news of this reaches people and that communities use it. That's really, you're correct in identifying that as the primary goal of this tool. And so we'll see. I mean, kudos to EJ for, she's the one who put this webinar together. It never would have occurred to me that there would be this much interest in it, but I think we've seen today that there's actually a lot of widespread interest in these tools. And so hopefully the more we can spread the word and get the information out there, communities can start thinking about how to incorporate this type of information in a wide variety of programs, not just related to wildfire or hazards.
I'll just chime in real quick to add to that too. I think it's a pretty well recognized gap in our understanding right now about how these tools are being used and practically applied on the ground by communities and practitioners. I think they're very widely utilized in the academic research environment, but something that I think we're really interested in is trying to get a better handle on and understand how they're being applied in these real world contexts, and now more specifically in the context of wildfire. So that's something we're certainly keeping tabs on, and hopefully one of the results of Senate Bill 762's emphasis on equity in this tool will be that we have an opportunity to do some follow-up and really collect information on how it's utilized going forward.
Okay, great. Tanya is asking if you can expand on the challenges with the 2020 census data and the underrepresentation of 18.8 million people, mostly BIPOC, and how you're addressing that.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I think, especially given that there has just been released information that it was a very intentional strategy, right? So there were numerous problems with the 2020 census, not the least of which was COVID, greatly impacting census takers' ability to get out there, because remember, COVID really hit full force in March. The census 100% count is usually conducted all the way through April and parts of May. So not only were there administrative decisions that were likely to lead to undercounts of people, there were also COVID-related factors. Unfortunately, that's not really something that we can do anything about. The goal of the census is to try to, as they create these estimates, deal with those known factors as much as possible, which is part of the reason why this 2020 data was delayed twice in its release, was because the census was scrambling to try to figure out how to account for those. I haven't compared those coefficients of variations with the 2020 data release with other data releases. I think it's highly likely that they're higher, those margins of error. So when the census releases an estimate, they also release a margin of error. And those can be really big in rural areas. So the census tries to deal with that as much as they can. There's very little that I know about that we can do on our end to accommodate that. Hope for better in the next data release.
Thanks. So one question I think a lot of folks are likely to have here is how this project and the SVI compares to or relates to federal equity-related mapping efforts, such as like the Rural Development's tool for mapping underserved communities. There's a beta version of the climate and economics justice screening and other efforts like that.
Yeah, so the Rural Development tool, if I'm remembering correctly, actually uses the same methodology. They use the CDC SVI as the base for that, if I remember correctly. So that's kind of one of those things when these things oftentimes have different titles, but when you dive into the methods, you can see like, is it adapted from SOVI? Is it adapted from BRIC? Is it adapted from CDC SVI? And I'm pretty sure the rural development SVI one is similar to ours actually. And do you want to talk about the equity, Justice? You're more up to speed on that.
Yeah, so this is sort of what we were trying to get at early on in this presentation, was doing that overview of how these sort of big constructs are similar and different, but that the tools themselves, they share a lot of similarities in terms of data and methods. The climate and justice screening tool was specifically developed as a part of Biden's Justice 40 initiative to inform the allocation of resources to disadvantaged communities. And so it's similar to some of these other indices, but it's actually a binary output. So it labels a community as disadvantaged or not based on either environmental or climate factors and how those intersect with demographic information such as race, level of education, and socioeconomic status. I think they use income as their proxy for sort of wealth and socioeconomic status in that index. So they're very similar in some ways. They're also different in terms of their intended use, right? The climate justice mapping tool is a screening tool that's supposed to just say, here are generally disadvantaged areas where we might want to prioritize resources or programming in this very specific context of climate justice. It also uses a lot of the same census data we've been talking about for all of these other tools.
Okay, great. A question from Mark is, how do you communicate, or do you communicate the embedded estimate uncertainty to state agency partners who are using the index for allocation decisions? And he gives a couple examples in there of, how do you have confidence in that?
That is such a good question. And it's something that we really struggled with for months, honestly. And it is a huge part of the reason why we were part of this ad hoc working group with state agencies and folks who are interested in these measures, because I think coming from a sort of academic bent, the reliability issues loomed large to us, right? Like, how can we be throwing these numbers out there? I think the practitioner viewpoint, rightfully so, is, well, if this is the best we can do, we'll take it. And so that is why we struck a balance by mapping the overall SVI, understanding for our perspective, what the level of, how variable the reliability was across these different geographies and across the different variables, embedding that information. It's publicly available, it's in Scholars Archive, but we did not get the sense from the folks that we talked to who were likely to be using this, that they were going to look, it really does come down to this question of, well, if this is what we have, this is the data that we have, right? So they were much more interested in specificity and less concerned about reliability. And I think that that's okay, because as we mentioned, we try to encourage people whenever possible to use this in conjunction with local knowledge and expertise. So if we think about a practitioner who's focused on one particular county, they're going to know that county better than a map of SVI is going to tell them. And so hopefully they can take some of this information with the appropriate caveats that, it's not 100%. There's a lot that we know is masked because we're aggregate, because of the way the sample is run. There's a lot of messiness in this data, but it does represent probably the best look that we can get at social vulnerability.
Great. So yeah, I just want to be aware of time. We're 1 minute past the hour. We have only 2 questions left, which I can, send to you and you can answer them separately, or if you want, you go ahead and stay a few minutes later and answer them here. It's really up to you. I imagine we'll probably be losing some people at the hour here.
Yeah, that's fine. I think we can, if there's just 2 more, let's wrap them up.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we have one from Adrian, and he says, I understand the need to use different size geographic areas that have similar population size. But because some tracts are really small, like in urban areas, how do you think about making sure these small geographic areas with a high population density are not overlooked and forgotten when financial resources are being decided?
That's a really good question. I hadn't really thought about it from that angle, to be perfectly honest. But the important thing to remember is that with the block groups and with the tracks, the total population in any given place is pretty equivalent, right? So they may not constitute a large area, but if they show up as highly vulnerable, it represents roughly the same number of highly vulnerable people, likely to be vulnerable people, as a large area. The other thing, though, to think about, and this is where it gets really interesting, is the way that Senate Bill 762 is written. It's really kind of about the intersection of all these three pieces of information. So the wildfire risk, the WUI, and social vulnerability. And it's the changes to building codes and stuff are only going to affect a very, very minute subpart of the state. Only 4.4% of the land area of Oregon is in the WUI. And it's only those people in the WUI who are in the higher extreme risk class that are going to have potentially some new building codes. Social vulnerability, the way it's written into SB 762, is much more flexible in how it might be considered by the different agencies. And so I guess the hope is that the agencies would be able to differentiate between, for example, we know a lot of the WUI is going to be in the area adjacent to some of these large towns. So those are likely to be block groups that are relatively small in area, right? A lot of those giant block groups are areas that are predominantly public lands. So they're delineated for every area, even though there's lots of areas where hardly anybody lives. And so those aren't part of the WUI because they're just too remote and dispersed population. I don't think that answered your question, but I do think it is worth keeping in mind that the number of people represented in each block group is roughly equivalent. So when we're talking about who's impacted, the numbers are the same. The area is very different. And hopefully the combination of these three layers used together will direct resources towards where it could do the most good. Let's hope, right? That it's going to go to places that are at risk and have high vulnerability. But we'll see. It's a little bit flexible how agencies use this information.
Great, thank you. And I also want to say thank you to Mirka for answering some of the Explorer tool things in the chat. So I appreciate that. And so our last question is from Anna, and she said, she may have missed this part of it, but when you calculate the final SVI rank for an area, how do you weigh each indicator theme? Is each theme weighted equally, or is each indicator weighted equally? And then as a sub question, are there situations where it would be appropriate to adjust the weighting of different indicators?
Yeah, that is a great question and very astute observation. So the themes are weighted equally, so not the component indicators, right? So some themes have, I think, 5 indicators and some have 2. So that means that those component indicators, when they go into the final SVI, have different weights. You absolutely could think about different weighting schemes, right? I mean, and part of the reason why we ended up mapping them at the theme level is because we feel like that kind of captures some of that. So if for your purpose, transportation is you think the most reliable indicator of vulnerability, you can just look at that transportation theme. But yeah, you can take any of these, you could just do an SVI across all 15 indicators, and then they would be equally weighted, and that would look slightly different. So yeah, great question.
Okay, and I think that's it. I think we had a lot of really great questions, and I think I hope we answered them all for everybody. But if not, I'm sure you could follow up with Mindy and Caitlin.
Yeah, thanks really everyone for coming to this and participating. It's really great to see the interest in this type of work, and here's hoping it leads to better equity in all the things that we do.
Great. Thank you so much, Mindy, Caitlin, EJ, and everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye.